Good evening, I'm Pastor Dustin Abbott from Emmanuel Lighthouse United Pentecostal Church here in Petawawa, Ontario, Canada, and we are here for our 5th lesson in our series on anger management. Now, in this particular lesson, we are going to be exploring the differences between the two major types of anger expression, or the way that people experience anger. Some people experience those in an explosive fashion, others will experience it in an implosive fashion. This is a really important lesson because I believe it helps those of us that look at ourselves and say, well, I'm not an outwardly angry person. Very few people have ever seen me angry, and we can conclude that we have no issue with anger. When in reality, many people struggle with an internalized anger that can be equally destructive in the long run. And so this lesson is really important, not only in helping you to identify the symptoms of either externalized, explosive anger, or internalized or implosive anger and its damaging effect, but then also how to deal with either type of anger. Our quote for the week comes from Dr. Joyce Brothers, and it says, "Anger repressed can poison a relationship as surely as the cruelest words." Certainly, once again, a lot of truth to that. The flame shot upward, fueled by a break in a city gas line. The line had ruptured when a private contractor clearing land clipped a gas pipe. At first, just pressurized gas poured out, hissing loudly. But within 30 minutes, a random spark had ignited the natural gas, which flamed skyward. Within minutes, the fiery plume was almost 5 stories high, and only a few yards away from a Chicago public housing unit that lodged senior citizens. Fortunately, police and others evacuated the residents from the building, but when the gas company finally stopped the fuel line feeding the line, scores of people had been displaced, their housing gutted or scorched. 2 months later, another explosion would displace Chicago residents. This time, though, the explosion was planned. A series of dynamite charges rigged by a demolition company popped in succession, and one by one, 4 adjoining buildings at a different public housing project fell, crumbling to the ground and raising huge clouds of dust. But this explosion was actually an implosion, with building materials falling inward. The destruction had been planned strategically for months, and the charges also placed strategically to make sure that everything would collapse in upon itself. This was part of an ongoing project to replace crime-infested, rundown housing with new low-rise developments. In fact, former residents and other spectators watched a safe distance away. Some even applauded. So which was more destructive? Many would say the explosion that we read about first, but both the explosion and the implosion actually had equally destructive consequences. Many residents of both buildings felt just as displaced, equally displaced, because this was something that was destroyed against their wishes. Our point that we're going to explore in this lesson is that implosive anger can be just as damaging as explosive anger. And it realizes the truth that people don't get mad the same way. Some people have that hair trigger, that thin skin, and it's instantly obvious when they're angry. Their anger explodes out of them, and they wear their hearts on their sleeves, as the saying goes. All it takes is 1 second to look at them, and you can see that they are angry. Maybe the veins are bulging in their neck, and their face turns red, and you can see a visible manifestation of anger. And so those that don't experience that kind of anger, and maybe I've described an exaggerated version of that, but all of us know someone who does struggle with explosive anger. Some of us that don't experience anger that way, we may look at that person and say, well, I don't have an anger problem. Assuming that because anger doesn't explode out of us like they do with that person, that we don't struggle with anger. Some people would say, I don't really have a temper, and yet if they're honest, they inwardly seethe over things and they brood. So if we are honest, we will admit that most of us have never really learned how to handle anger positively. And in those early lessons, when we talked about how that anger is designed by God and that God gets angry and that anger does have a purpose, we look at that and we sigh a little bit because it's hard for us to reconcile what we experience and what we do when we're angry with these virtuous aspects of anger that we have explored. So in this lesson, we're going to both look at explosive and then implosive anger, maybe helping to expose it for what it is, and so that we can identify and then work towards correcting it. Let me give you a couple of examples of those that struggle with explosive anger. These are both real people, although their names have been changed, that Dr. Gary Chapman, in the book that we are kind of using as a kind of a template / baseline for this series, people that came into his practice and that he has dealt with. The first of those we'll call Margaret. Margaret was a screamer. When someone provoked her anger, whether child, husband, or employer, the person heard about it. Margaret prided herself on speaking her mind, and she would say, "At least people know where they stand with me." But in truth, Margaret's anger was out of control. It had begun as a teenager, and she had fallen into a pattern of verbally abusive behavior that had continued for 25 years. Now, she always justified her tirades, until, at least, the day that her daughter left her the following note. And before I go further, I want you to note in both of these notes that we're about to read some important things that we're going to attach ourselves to in just a few moments. But in this case, her daughter's note says, "Dear Mom, I won't be home tonight. I can't take your screaming anymore. I don't know what will happen to me, but at least I won't have to hear all the nasty things you say to me when I don't do everything you want." She signed the note, Lizzie. Margaret didn't scream when she read Lizzie's note. In fact, she called her pastor in tears. First, she said only, "Lizzie has left. I don't know where she's gone. I'm so worried about her." But then she said the most hopeful thing that she had said in years. "I drove her away. I know I drove her away. My screaming and yelling drove her away." Sobbing into the phone, she admitted for the first time that her angry tongue lashings towards Lizzie were wrong. The pastor wisely guided Margaret to a Christian counselor, where she began the process of admitting, understanding, and changing her negative responses to anger. Lizzie was located within 48 hours and later joined her mother in counseling. Today, Lizzie, now a grown woman, has a good relationship with her mother. Margaret says that the day she got her daughter's note was the worst and best day of her life. On the other hand, Paul, his abuse tended towards the nonverbal. Whenever he was angry with someone, he would throw things, break things, and make rude gestures in traffic. Paul had gone so far as to hurl soft drink bottles in family arguments. Natalie had seen some of these characteristics in Paul before she married him, but he had never vented his anger toward her. But within 6 months after their wedding, he pushed her against the wall. She knew that his behavior was something she could not condone. She wrote him the following letter and mailed it to his office. "Dear Paul, last night you did something I never thought you would do. In anger, you pushed me against the wall. I had seen you express anger while we were dating, but I never thought you would express it toward me. Now I know that I was wrong. I love you very much, and I don't believe you really want to hurt me, but I cannot take that chance. I am writing you because I want you to know that if you ever touch me again in an angry way, I will leave and stay gone until I am assured by a counselor that it is safe to live with you. I love you, Nat." The evening after Paul received the letter, he apologized profusely to Natalie and assured her that it would never happen again. 6 months later, however, in a fit of anger, he grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her. Natalie didn't say a word, but the next day when he came home, Paul found the following note. "I love you too much to stay and let you hurt me and destroy your self-esteem. I know you cannot be happy about what happened last night. I will not return until your counselor assures me that you have learned to handle your anger in a more responsible manner. Love, Natalie." Her decisive response motivated Paul to call his pastor and then a counselor. He knew that he was in danger of losing his wife. He also knew that he had to learn to control his anger. After 3 months of individual counseling and 3 months of marital counseling, Natalie and Paul were reunited. Years later, they are still together. Paul succeeded, with help, in breaking his pattern of abuse. Now, both Margaret and Paul, they fell into abusive patterns of expressing anger. One of them was verbal and the other was physical. Such behaviors, they form over the period of years. And as we saw in both of these great examples, they typically do not change unless someone important to the individual pressures the person to get help. You'll note that in both cases, there was a moment of confrontation from a significant person in their lives. In the first case with Margaret, it was Lizzie, her daughter. In the case of Paul, it was Natalie, his wife, who stood up to him and confronted him with the truth of what was going on. And it is typically the threat of losing a significant relationship, something that the angry person values, that will motivate the abuser to get help. Now, unfortunately, many people end up inadvertently enabling an angry person like this because rather than lovingly confront them, they instead, try to deceive themselves into thinking that if they just duck their head and they give it time, that in time things will get better. But unfortunately, that is almost never the case. An explosively angry person has a genuine problem. They have an anger that explodes out of its proper banks and takes a destructive form. And unless there is some opposing force that causes them to be honest about it and to address it, they will very likely continue in this same pattern, often getting worse rather than better. So family members and friends must learn to hold the explosively angry person accountable for anything to change. Explosive, angry behavior is never constructive. And while it's easy to see if you're the person being abused, how that, explosive anger damages other people, or maybe if you've observed someone explosively angry damaging other people around them, it's easy to see the damage that they cause. But what is equally true is that there is an internal damage that is taking place. It is destroying the self-esteem of the person who is out of control. Very often they experience deep and profound regret after their anger is spent over the words or the actions that they have committed during that angry session. But unfortunately, while it erodes their self-esteem, while it makes them feel worse about themselves, they've done so much damage that this becomes a compounding situation. Often people that are in a relationship with an explosively angry person, out of self-defense, they begin to avoid that person. And if they don't have a direct relationship, maybe you know someone who they just easily fly off the handle. And so you find that you guard your every word that you say around them. You don't really engage in in-depth conversation or talk about anything really significant or important because you're too afraid of mentioning some kind of trigger for them that will cause them to fly off the handle. And if this pattern repeats itself a few times, you will eventually begin to just instinctively avoid them altogether. That's not so easy for a person that, say a spouse that is, directly connected to that person. But what ends up happening is that slowly but surely, an explosively angry person will begin to destroy all of their relationships around them. The casual relationships will diminish because people, they don't have to deal with that person, and so they won't. And those that are closer to that person, they will begin to withdraw from them in fear of the consequence of their explosive anger. And of course, the more isolated the angry person becomes, the more bitter and angry they often become because they feel like they can feel that they are a pariah, so to speak, that they're being ostracized. And so there is this battle that's taking place. They feel very defensive because they already know within themselves their self-esteem is being eroded. They have a lot of regret over actions and words that they have spoken. And then as they see people, avoiding them, even if they're trying to do it unobtrusively, but they notice that, it ends up causing, even greater feelings of kind of just resentment and anger at the world. And unfortunately, their anger problem, it only increases at this point. Now, some years ago, it was popular, in kind of the pop psychology of the day, that, if people that, experienced, kind of explosive anger, they were encouraged to kind of take the anger out on non-animate things, so, punch pillows or, beat up on a punching bag, or to take out their aggression on a golf ball, a variety of different things. But the idea is that, there's these kind of pent up, angry, explosions that if they explode in a less destructive way, it will help the person to kind of vent and to feel better and to move on. However, almost all modern research now indicates that the venting of angry feelings through aggressive behaviors does not drain a person's anger, but actually causes them to be more likely to be explosive in the future. What you're actually doing is creating neural pathways that say that those violent, explosive actions are an acceptable way to deal with anger. But explosion, whether it is a verbal or a physical explosion, is simply not an acceptable way of handling one's anger. Your anger has done nothing constructive, and instead it is going to be destructive to relationships and to your own soul. So again, I want to re-emphasize that very often explosive anger is not corrected until some kind of intervention takes place. That could be, coming from the source of a loving confrontation from family that has been abused by that explosive behavior. Maybe they explode at work and work, imposes counseling upon them. One of the easier ways is a person coming to God and being convicted of their explosive anger. Or maybe even after they've come to God, there being a service where conviction falls heavily, and they go to an altar of repentance, and God holds a mirror up to them and shows them how destructive their actions have been and causes there to be change. And of course, the latter is what we might always hope for. But I tell you this today, that if you are an explosively angry person, you need to recognize that, and you need to take the bull by the horns. And you cannot deceive yourself into thinking, well, I'll have more control the next time. Wishing for something does not make it so. You've got to take positive steps. You need to get into counseling. You need to explore why it is that you have this out of control anger, and begin to practice disciplines in your life that are going to help you to not just control that anger, but to deal with what is the root cause of anger within you. But you have to have open eyes and self-honesty in saying, I've got a problem and I need to find help. But if you're a person that's in a relationship with an explosively angry person, know that you are not doing them a favor by enabling that behavior. I know that most of us, we avoid confrontation like the plague. But as we saw in our opening stories to this section, that in both cases, it took a confrontation from a daughter, from a wife, to confront either the mother or the husband and to say, your behavior is not acceptable. I love you. And that's an important thing. We saw in both cases, there was an expression of love that was there. It was not a closing down of a door or a rejection of a person, but rather it was a loving confrontation that says, what you're doing is not acceptable. It's not acceptable to me. It should not be acceptable to you. It's not acceptable to God. And I love you. However, I won't put myself in harm's way. I will not put up with this kind of behavior. And very often it is that loving confrontation that allows the pattern to be broken. Now you say, I don't know if I could do that. Do note that in both situations, the examples that we were given, they enabled that transition through, rather than a face-to-face confrontation, through a note or a letter. That was a means of communication that did not put themselves in any harm's way, through whatever potentially violent or angry reaction might come through that person. And so maybe that might be a legitimate means for yourself. And very likely it is going to involve some inconvenience to confront this and to help a person deal with it. But the point is that if you care about that person that you're in relationship with, it should be worth the risk, worth the cost to helping them to be healed and to restored. We're going to devote another lesson later on in this series to examining confrontation, loving confrontation with a little more care. And so we don't have time to do so in this lesson, but I hope that I've at least given you a framework to start from. Now, the second type of anger that we're going to look at is implosion. So we talked about in our first illustration of the two buildings that one of those was a planned implosion. And so it's designed in such a way the explosive charges are placed very carefully calculated, and so that when they are detonated, that the destruction remains internal. Instead of everything blowing outwards, in a very dangerous pattern, everything is designed to collapse in upon itself. This is a great illustration of what happens to those who hold anger inside. Eventually, their life will literally crumble around due to the destructive power of their internalized anger. Now, it's easy to see explosive anger, but implosive anger is not as easily recognized because it is held inside. Now, Christians are obviously and correctly quick to condemn explosive behavior. All of us know that that's not acceptable. But as we've already said, implosive anger is just as destructive in the long run. You see, a person that is dealing with internal anger, often they never address the source, the cause of that anger. And it's, a common thing that someone who internalizes anger is that they actually redirect. They will redirect their angry feelings because they don't react in the moment. They don't just blow their top. And so say it's a confrontation with their boss, or maybe not a confrontation, but some kind of abuse or mistreatment by their boss. And so what they will often do is they'll internalize that anger, but then they'll end up taking it out. They're afraid to confront their boss, so they'll take it out on a softer, weaker target, be it their spouse, their kids, or even the dog. But unfortunately, misplaced anger and redirected anger, it actually just spreads the problem. It enlarges the pattern of abuse, and it does nothing to correct the situation that actually provoked the anger to begin with. And while explosive anger does vent, howbeit destructively, and we've talked about how that explosively angry people, they explode, they often cause a lot of damage. And so in no way am I saying this is a positive thing. But what does often happen is that once their anger has vented, they experience regret over their actions. And often, it's in some cases it's too little too late, but often they'll try to make restitution and to set things right because they recognize that their anger exploded out of control. But internalized anger has no natural release. And so the internal pressure just builds and builds. And often the person experiencing the internalized anger, they're in a state of denial. No, I'm not angry. And they'll deny it again and again. And they deny it until denial becomes impossible. Explosive anger begins with rage and can turn to violence. But implosive anger begins with silence and withdrawal. And in time, it leads to resentment, bitterness, and eventually hatred. Furthermore, it has a vast physiological impact upon the person that experiences this kind of anger. And because they have internalized that anger, it can really be destructive to them. So there are typically three common symptoms of implosive anger. They include denial, withdrawal, and then brooding. We'll examine all three of those here together. A person who internalizes their anger often denies that they are angry at all. They will typically not even characterize what they're feeling as anger because they think of anger only being the explosive variety. And this, as I've mentioned in earlier lessons, I believe it's a pretty easy pitfall for Christians who believe that anger itself is evil. And so they start by denying anger because they never want to acknowledge anger, and that can really feed internalized anger. So for example, they'll say things like this: I'm not angry, but I'm very frustrated. Or I'm not angry, I'm just upset. Or I'm not angry, but I am disappointed. Or I'm not angry, I just don't like it when people do me wrong. Let me tell you what all of these people are. They're angry. They're using other language to describe it, but what they are experiencing is anger. Beverly illustrates this clearly. Dr. Chapman says, sitting in my office on an October morning, she said to me, I know that Christians are not supposed to get angry, and I don't think that I am. There's that denial. But I'm so upset, there's the euphemism, at what has happened that I don't know what to do. My brother talked my parents into selling their house and giving him the money to start a business. He moved them into a small apartment, promised to pay their monthly rent as long as they lived, and said that if they ever needed to go into a retirement center, by then he would be able to afford it. He did all of this without discussing the matter with me. And I know my brother. His business ideas are always wild. Within 2 years, he will lose all the money and my parents will be on welfare. When I found out what had happened, I called him and he matter-of-factly told me about the whole process. He said I knew I would not be upset. He knew I would not be upset because we both had talked about earlier that they needed to be in a smaller place. I told him that I understood and I was sure it would work out. But the more I think about it, the more upset I get. Now, Beverly is obviously experiencing intense anger, but because she believes anger to be unchristian, she doesn't want to call it anger, so she uses the word upset. However, where the real denial takes place is in her conversation with her brother. When he explained the situation to her, she gave him the impression that she considered his actions to be acceptable, whereas in reality, she thought them very unacceptable. And so he doesn't even know that she's angry, but she is seething inside with anger. If she doesn't change her approach, the bombs of implosion will become deeply rooted inside of her, and in due time, her life will collapse. Denying anger doesn't make it go away. Even if you pretend you are not angry, remember that your body and your mind, it experiences anger on a subconscious level. And so you can mentally deny that you are angry, but your body is still going to experience the symptoms of anger. And in fact, that discordance of mind and experience, that denial often creates a very uncomfortable internal contradiction. Suppressing anger, holding it inside, will eventually lead to both psychological and physiological stress. There is a growing body of research that shows a positive correlation between suppressed anger and hypertension, colitis, migraine headaches, and heart disease. And so there are some very real physical ramifications of internalizing anger and dwelling in that position of contradiction between your mind and what you're actually experiencing in your body. But greater still is the impact upon your psychological and mental health, because internalized anger always leads to resentment, bitterness, and often hatred. And these are all clearly condemned in Scripture, and we can know with certainty that they are sinful responses to anger. So denial is an incredibly destructive aspect of internalized anger. A second common symptom of internalized anger is withdrawal. That becomes often the central strategy of people who struggle with implosive anger. Even if they admit to their anger, their solution is to withdraw from the person or the situation that caused the anger. And their idea is that if they create distance from the person, for example, I'll just stay away. I'll just avoid them for a while. The idea is that their anger will go away. And as a pastor, I often have, counseled or dealt with people who that really was their strategy. And sometimes they think the solution is, well, I just need to stay away from church for a while, or I just need to avoid that other person for a while, and after a while, I'll feel better. But that isn't actually true. That's not the way that it works. Sure, you may not consciously think about it as much after a while, but you know that it hasn't been resolved, because the moment that person does something to you again or irritates you in some way, all of that resentment just flares right back up. And it's there just as fresh because it's never been dealt with, never been resolved. Someone that is, going through withdrawal, they will, someone might ask, is something wrong? And they'll say, no. What makes you think something's wrong? And if the person pursues the issue by saying, well, you've been quieter than usual, maybe you haven't asked me about my day, you haven't said anything about yours, the person that is the withdrawer, they will likely respond, well, I'm just tired, or I've had a hard day, and then walk out of the room. That silent treatment of that moment can last for a day, but it can even last for years. And the longer it lasts, the more certain it is that anger and bitterness will grow and fester, often to a place where it becomes incredibly destructive. Furthermore, someone who is, using the withdrawal strategy, internalized anger will often create passive-aggressive behavior. So what we mean by passive-aggressive behavior is that there is an element of passivity. On the outside, you will say nothing is wrong. You will deny, maybe even deny being angry. But that anger will manifest itself through quietly aggressive and manipulative actions or words. Someone like that will smile to your face, everything's okay, and then stab you in the back. A common manifestation is being uncooperative. Give you another example from Dr. Chapman. Andy, for example, was exhibiting passive-aggressive behavior towards his wife, Rachel. He was angry with Rachel because she expressed no interest in sexual intimacy. Though Andy refused to discuss the matter openly with Rachel, when she asked him to help with the kids' baths, he simply continued checking his emails, not even acknowledging her request. When she asked him to please wash some windows on Saturday, he planned an outing with his son. Most of the time, Andy was not even fully conscious of what he was doing in anger, but he was still getting back to her, letting her know that he was angry at her, even if he denied being angry. And what about Rachel? Her lack of interest in sexual intimacy also could have been a passive-aggressive act. She might have been storing her own anger towards Andy because he had failed to spend quality time with her. She would not discuss the issue that sparked her anger, and so her anger had gone underground, but it still showed itself in her behavior. And so the passive-aggressive pattern begins a vicious cycle. And unless this destructive cycle is broken, it is only a matter of time until their marriage implodes. Maybe you can identify with some aspects of that and recognize that some of your actions may have been these passive-aggressive type behaviors, and very likely they are a symptom of internalized anger. Stubbornness or subtle manipulations, cutting little words or, those kind of barbed statements that have a sting on them. They are common symptoms of passive-aggressive behavior. This becomes a very difficult cycle to break if you're in a relationship, particularly where two parties are exhibiting passive-aggressive behavior, because it's never really brought into the open. A light is never really shown on it, and so it stays there festering and destructive. The third symptom that is very common of internalized anger is brooding. Now, brooding is when we mentally replay the initial scene of wrongdoing over and over in our minds like a looped video. All of the details become increasingly vivid because we're fixating on it. And often that feeling, the pressure of anger, just grows and grows. A brooding person wallows in their anger like a pig in slop. And that video loop, however, is only playing in their own minds. Often someone who broods, they're, recounting a situation where they felt like they were aggrieved or wounded, and they can imagine themselves telling that person off or standing up for themselves or even violently reacting and punching them in the face. But it's all only in their head. In the moment of confrontation, they might show little to no reaction at all, but then they will go away and they will stew on that and brood on it again and again. But the problem, once again, is that the anger is never processed. They never confront the person, nor do they involve the help of a friend or a counselor, but it's all staying within their own heads, with their own minds. And so that anger easily develops into resentment and bitterness, and after a while, even to hatred. If the brooding process is not interrupted, the person will eventually experience one of two outcomes. There will be an internal explosion where they collapse in on themselves. This could be an emotional breakdown going into a state of depression, or even considering or committing suicide. Or if the pressure builds, it could also explode in a different kind of way, an act of violence towards the person who wronged them. And as is often the case with internalized anger, when they explode far out of proportion to the actual matter at hand. Their response is not just. Often in the cases of those who commit acts of murder and violence, neighbors and co-workers, family members, they're surprised. Neighbors will say, well, he seemed like such a nice man, such a quiet man. Well, that's a sure sign that that person was experiencing internalized anger. What they could not see because of the placid exterior was there was a volcano inside that had been building and building and was now erupting out of control. The Apostle Paul admonished, Ephesians 4:26-27 from the NIV, "In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold." I added that latter because I think that is really important when you're talking about internalized anger. That because you've kept it in, you're not dealing with it, you are giving Satan a foothold in your life to plant the seeds of destruction. Remember, the purpose of anger is not for anger to come and to linger. It's not designed by God to be a state of mind or a state of being, but rather it is to come, it is to cause and motivate right action, and then when resolved, it is to pass away. And so when we allow anger to linger, we are giving Satan a foothold in our life. Anger itself is not sin, but allowing anger to linger inside is. In fact, Solomon said from Ecclesiastes 7:9 in the NIV, he says, "Anger resides in the lap of fools." It is sitting right there, a constant companion with them. So the key there is abide. The fool allows anger to abide in them and to linger. But a wise person will deal with their anger quickly, and so see that that anger is resolved and removed. Again, anger was designed to be a visitor, not a resident. And so we need to deal with it that very day, resolve it, and so that we can move on and not linger in anger. All of us experience anger, but holding anger inside by denying, withdrawing, and brooding is not the Christian response to anger. Doing so clearly violates the teaching of Scripture. Bitterness is the result of stored anger, and bitterness is one of the things that Scripture warns us most against. It talks about, the Bible often uses the language of rooting, that bitterness, there's a root of bitterness that gets down and it can dig deep into a person's life and cause such incredible destruction. So in conclusion, let's talk about how to diffuse implosive anger. See, one of the great challenges of internalized anger as opposed to explosive anger is that it's less likely that you're going to get an intervention from an outside source. With an explosively angry person, we talked about how that it's often the responsibility of friends, family members, those that care about an angry person to lovingly confront them and to help to motivate change. That's harder to do with an internalized angry person because often no one knows that you are angry. And even those that get some inkling that you are, you very likely will deny it. And so there is little initiative to deal with that anger that comes from the outside, which means that there is more incumbency upon you to start the process from within. And so we need to directly confront all three of these sources or these symptoms of internalized anger. So denial must be combated by admitting your tendency to hold on to anger to yourself or to others. Just being honest about it, and again, in disclosure, internalized anger is something more that I've dealt with personally, far more than explosive types of anger. And one of the key things that I had to recognize in my life is just to see the pattern and to be honest about the pattern that is there, to recognize that I did tend to brood over things and allow them to just linger in my life. And thus, by being internally honest and saying, okay, I see what's going on here, I need to do something about it. And so starting there to where we start with confession, whether it's to ourselves and, if that's not sufficient, confessing to someone else that can help us, that you're struggling with this, because what you're doing is inviting participants into the process. And maybe it's as simple as inviting God into the process to help you, or inviting your own conscious self into the situation. But the more that you involve in that struggle, the more help you can get in breaking the cycle. The second thing of withdrawal must be combated by reaching out to a trusted friend or family member and seeking counsel. Reaching out to your pastor, for example. See, with help, you can make the decision to confront or to release the anger. But at least you'll be making a conscious and informed choice, and it's going to give you some closure, where denial never gives you closure. It allows the anger to just continue to linger. Third, brooding must be combated by clearing the air. Now, some people, they have a problem with being too external. I mean, they blurt out everything, and so their problem is that they show no discretion. That's a second issue that needs to be addressed. But people with a tendency to brood, they have the opposite problem. They bottle everything up inside, and they need to learn to vocalize what's going on inside. And, going back to myself for a moment, one of the steps that I had to intentionally take is that in those sources of conflict, often within my marriage, I had to challenge myself to, rather than just kind of, closing up inside, bottling it up, to try to learn to get better and better, and it's a process, of going to my wife and expressing the sources where I was feeling frustration or anger, and actually working towards resolving those things instead of allowing them to linger. And it's something I had to be intentional about, and also something that I've had to continue to work at, because you're often fighting against your own tendencies. But openness and honesty, both in your communication with God, and if that's not enough, finding a counselor or a pastor that can help you. And if you have experienced the symptoms, you kind of see the patterns, you may be able to be a help to others who are stuck because of internalized anger. Maybe you can see the symptoms in them because you've experienced them themselves, and you can help to draw them out. Now, that involves some measure of risk. Often a person that's in denial, they will continue to deny. But one of the best things you can do in that situation is to share your own struggles. Rather than coming to them in a situation that make them feel defensive, as if you're above them, you're looking down on them, rather come to them and in a spirit of vulnerability and saying, you know what, I feel like you may be going through something that I've experienced myself, and then sharing your own struggles with them. And in that kind of atmosphere of self-disclosure, it often creates a safer environment where they might feel more open to releasing some of the things and being honest about what's going on inside. But I'll say this, a true friend does not silently sit by and watch the self-destruction of their friend. They care enough to take a risk. So if we want to learn to process anger in a positive and loving way, we have to learn to avoid the destruction that is caused by either explosive or implosive anger. And if you recognize either of these patterns in your life, you need to confront them. Get help. Talk to your pastor. Talk to a trusted friend or family member. Talk to a professional counselor. It's okay for Christians to go to professionals and to get help. But we have to address these things, because if not, if they're left untreated, unchecked, they will be destructive in our lives. Your key to being a happy, fulfilled person and a successful Christian is to deal with the destructive patterns by dealing with your anger. So you say, in conclusion, you say, well, Pastor Abbott, that's great, except for, when we talk about avoiding, things and dealing with them the day of. But what if I've been angry for years or decades? What if it's not so simple a matter, but this anger has gone deep and dark into me? Well, we're going to explore that in our next lesson. There's an additional challenge that comes with anger that is deep-seated and long-standing in our lives. However, I do want to offer hope, even as we draw to a conclusion in this lesson, to let you know that we serve a God who is able to do all things. He's able to help you, even if your anger has gone deep and dark. But join us next week and we'll talk a little bit more about that. I pray that this lesson has helped you today, and maybe you've got some homework after today to go and to do some self-confession, to deal with some patterns that have developed in your life. But I believe that with God's help, you can do it. As Paul said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. God bless you. Have a wonderful evening.